Wow. I'm Joanna. I am so thrilled to have been invited to this event tonight, mostly just to listen to these other speakers. I mean, I've got goosebumps, and also just the privilege of being part of cross-movement conversations that we don't often have, but you know, we actually need to be having more of them, to be more interconnected, to be smarter, given the volatility and the complexity of the world that we're trying to navigate. And I also love that tonight is dedicated to Chris. Oh, there. This amazing question that was put in front of us, which is, how do we bring about long-term systemic change? And I think we've heard from all of our speakers tonight that pretty radical change is needed. I mean, we are facing a brink of multiple crises: catastrophic climate change, growing conflict, systemic racism, sexism, growing poverty, food insecurity, political corruption. You know the gamut. So where do we start? So I find that one very simple, overarching theory of change is this, where we stop the bad, build the good, change the rules, and change the story. This photo up in the top right-hand corner is of a spirit bear in the Great Bear Rainforest. And you might have seen the news of last month, where after a 20-year campaign, this incredible piece of land has been protected for centuries to come. But it is an agreement amongst the indigenous communities there, as well as the government, as well as environmental organizations, as well as the industry, to protect it. So if we were to start talking about these four pillars, and being here to talk a little bit about the environmental movement, if I was to start talking about the stop strategy, I think I'd have to start talking about the tar sands and the pipelines. You'd have to have been under a rock in the past few years if you haven't been hearing about this. There's a few insights that I can share with you about the tar sands campaign. It started 10 years ago, and so we need to think about any of these campaigns, this movement building, as really the long game. And really here is one where we cannot depend on the government. For 10 years, almost no environmental organization could get an audience with the government. In fact, we had to keep demonstrating the need to separate oil and state. Instead, we wanted to target the problem corporations directly and really undermine their social license, and building very, very strong alliances along the pipeline. So, from coast to coast to coast, we were connecting in many different ways, and communities to the issues in very different ways. Whether for some it was about water, for some it is about climate, for others it's about unruly corporate power, for some it's about the right to jobs, for some it's about health. And in many ways, it is about bringing together through marches, through celebrities, working with tar sands workers themselves, but most importantly, and I'm glad that Jessica was here right before me, it really was listening to and backing the struggles of indigenous communities who have sovereignty over these lands and these waters. And so the second thing is really about building the good. And so we couldn't only be about talking about stopping the tar sands. So we wanted to actually build a kind of a solar dream inside a tar sands nightmare. So we were, as Greenpeace, working behind the scenes in Alberta, working with the community in Little Buffalo, and which is really in the heart of the tar sands, but bringing solar power to solarize their community center. So some of you might say, well, what is that? It's one tiny community, one solarized community center. But the point was to create a symbol, something that could be scaled up, something that was demonstrating the creation of jobs and also demonstrating energy independence for First Nations communities. So as many of us will tell you, as organizers, we can't only be about what we're against. We also have to be about what we are for. We have to move from opposing to proposing, where we can tell a good news story, like the fact that solar energy and the price of it is going down radically, and that it's so available. As we like to say often in our office, when there's a huge solar spill, we just call it a nice day, right? So change the rules. This is something that many of us in many of our organizing often think of first, is that it's the kind of the legislative reform. It's the policy research for the policy change. And that is absolutely critical. And so we continue to do that work around building, changing the environmental laws, changing the entire environmental assessment process, whether we're drafting new policy guidelines or we're pushing for new standards. And again, now that Harper has moved on and we actually have a liberal government who is willing to make some of these changes, we can actually be pushing some of these things that are now possible. But I think what we've also heard, and I loved how Beatrice was at the beginning talking about also the need sometimes, the power of breaking the rules, and the power of nonviolent direct action. And that is really about how we need to find that flashpoint for very visible action as a lightning rod to illuminate the struggle, and a message that can often go viral in ways that other kind of changing the rules actions would not do. So some of you might recall back in 2010 the unveiling of two huge banners off of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. And it was a very, very simple act of nonviolent direct action that people still remember. And of course, it got national and international news. And it's actually many parliamentarians complain to us about, now that the security has increased significantly. But again, that piece of, that piece of a very simple act, again, it creates a mind bomb in which we can send a message much more quickly. And finally, it's about changing the story. And I love how the speakers before me have talked about telling the story. It is about telling our stories. And changing the story, as I refer to it, it's also about changing the narrative. So for so many years, of course, we've been told that we are all dependent upon fossil fuels, or that climate change doesn't exist. That has been a very, very dominant narrative. When I first joined this job, and I'd meet people on Bay Street, that's our financial sector right downtown here, for those of you who are not from Toronto, and they would just say, "You guys are ridiculous. I mean, of course we have to believe in the inevitability of our fossil fuel dependency. It's not possible." And now, it's incredible within just 2 years, in some of the most unlikely places, that you can hear people talk about the fact that we will achieve 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. And that was a story that we started telling 10 years ago. And that story now exists in the minds and hearts of people and policymakers around the world. So do not underestimate the power of telling a new story and changing the story. And so imagine if, as a food movement, we talked about the inevitability of the fact that in 10 years, no one in Canada would go to bed hungry. That narrative is something that we have to be talking about and building towards. And we also have to be talking about with those communities that we're working with and those people that we're trying to mobilize, is that we can show them a better life. And we can show them a life that is actually going to make them happier. I've just learned that of new research that shows that the generations that are alive today are the most lonely that have ever lived because of our interaction with screens, and also because so many more of us are urbanized. We actually don't know our neighbors anymore. So imagine this epidemic of loneliness, and yet the work that we're all doing in this room is about building community, and about building connection, and about building good health. I mean, we are part of the happiness solution, and we can demonstrate that to others. So some of you might want to know, how do you go about doing that in your organizations? How do we go about changing this? Well, you know, at Greenpeace, we are setting about it in very specific ways. You know, we're changing some of the job descriptions. We're hiring different people. Digital organizers, local group organizers. We are promoting storytellers. And it also means actively listening to our supporters, actively listening, and also actively listening to some of our enemies. It means joining new alliances and sometimes putting away our logo and putting away our brand, and so that the big bad Greenpeace brand doesn't get in the way. It also means seeing ourselves in diverse movements, and we see actually as diversity as part of innovation. It's also central to resilience, actually. And you know, those of you who are into farming, you will know that monocrops are the least resilient. That biodiversity is the most resilient to a fire that comes through a natural forest. That is more diverse will be more able to withstand a fire. So diversity is part of our innovation, it's part of our resilience. And so we have to see ourselves as building new power. And that new power is exciting because it's really about being open and less secretive and participatory and peer-driven. And so you can't hoard power, you actually channel it. You know, in one sentence, it could be that old power is about downloading and command and control, where new power uploads and shares. And so we've had to move from seeing ourselves as the hero, but now as a hero amongst heroes. And so in that vein, all that we are learning right now that might be relevant to some of you in this room is now publicly available. It should have been on this slide, but it's mobilizationlab.org. I'll make sure that Nick gets it. So it's all of the greatest ideas on how to do mobilizing and campaigning with concrete examples and case studies from all over the world. And if there are a bunch of foodies out there, we've actually just pulled together our first mobilization cookbook, which is quite clever. And so on that, I think I wanted to leave you with what I think is a slightly inspiring video, which brings together a lot of what I feel like I've been able to share with you tonight.